And sorry, I'm interrupting. I'm not hearing Noah on Skype.
Okay, you hear me now?
Yep,
Got me
I do.
now?
Okay.
All right.
I'll edit out the bits at the beginning. So you are live now.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. We appreciate you joining us for our presentation today. We have Sandy Chen with us to talk about how technology is changing storytelling. If you are a fan of The Witcher, you're familiar with Sandy's award-winning work. I know we have a few educators in the audience, and they will find the book Serious Games useful. That's a book Sandy co-authored with David Michael. I'm going to turn this over to Sandy now, and I'll be back when she's done to tell you more about today's tour of Immersive Edge. Take it, Sandy.
Hi. Hi, everyone. Thank you for all coming. I'm so honored and excited to be here in this wonderful space to talk to you today. My name is Sandy Chen. I'm a writer and a game designer. And specifically, I write for video games. So definitely my workspace is at the intersection between technology and storytelling. And sometimes it's at the point of railing against these limitations of technology. And other times it's about finding new ways of expression through the particular medium or the expansion of the medium through various technological advances, such as the movie camera or the sound recorder. And this has happened many times throughout history, whether it's a book to a pop-up book with little figures that children can interact with, or through the introduction of sound to cinema. I don't necessarily think that one thing has to replace another. For instance, we can have books and we can still have 6-word stories on Twitter, but rather we can nurture these different forms and types of storytelling. Technology, I believe, for the most part, doesn't change the artistry, the heart and soul of storytelling, other than it gives us more options. It gives us more tools in our toolbox and more ways to reach our audience. But what it has affected is the relationship between authors and audience, of how we as spectators and as readers and as participants or even as co-designers get to experience stories. And that's part of what we're going to experience today. So let me take you on this fast trip on an evolution of storytelling. Next slide, please. Here we go. So a lot of times when people like to talk about the beginning of storytelling, they go back to Aristotle and poetics and Greek tragedy, former structures with like a beginning, middle, and end. And that's not such a great starting point to talk about participatory storytelling or interactive fiction or stories that don't necessarily have ending points or even one ending point. Maybe they have multiple ending points or even a formal start point. But rather, I want to take us back to like the beginning of mankind of time. This is storytelling predates any other form of oral history. And when we get back to where our ancient tribals past was, back to the time when our elders gathered us around, like places like this, and wanted to pass on knowledge through ritualized dance or ask participants to role play, to become archetypical figures from the past, and think about how they would approach the problems that were faced by their ancestors. Those stories have been used to record these important events and to celebrate heroes and heroines and transmit all the facts and spirits of these major events. But also, storytelling evolved as a deep need to understand our relationship with the world and with each other, and to understand the forces of nature, of powerful, unimaginable forces, the supernatural, life and death, and all the powerful emotions that are part of our lives, to understand what is our place in the world and how do we relate. Next slide, please. Woo! So here we have a bison from one of the first cave art that was ever found. And even when we look at cave art, it was a way to connect the viewer, to let others know about the glory and the thrill of the hunt. Not only to show the magnificence of these hunts, but to sort of put it down into history books, so to speak. It was more of a wish you were here moment. So on some of these cave art, we can see brush marks and even images of 8 legs to try to indicate movement, to try to convey what it was like to be at that hunt. And here we see that the artist was pushing against the limitations of and not being able to express exactly what it was like. And as our society evolved, these written and flat forms took prevalence. We made cities and we moved away from the tribal fireplace, and we further continued this exploration, but it still didn't have that deep participatory sense that we could have at the tribal fireplace. Next slide, please. So when we look at Cubism, which is interesting in terms of how do we portray a 3D image into a 2D space, it was sort of a concept of, if we walk around a statue in 3D space, how do you convey that experience? And even if we look back a few years back with Monet and the haystacks and the lily ponds, those were all about the effects of time on a location, from midday to dusk, from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. How do you convey this change of light and colors and the perception? And how do you convey that visceral feeling that you would get from seeing the sunlight stream down at noon versus how does it feel when you get to the point when it's at dusk? So these are all interesting questions that are all about trying to convey a story, but in a limited, flat space. Next slide. And even when we moved to film, and beyond the time when it was straight recording of plays and learning about how to use film and the parlor tricks, we could now witness the effect of time, and we could walk around a statue. And we found that our mind makes connections between images. And not only that, we could evoke real emotions from the placement of those images, and through straight lines and curved lines, through diagonal motion or forward motion, from the color, from the tone, from the pacing, and so forth. And moreover, we could now get enraptured by characters and their stories. We could form the emotional attachments to want to know what was going to happen in their lives. Next slide, please. Still yet, we wanted to explore narrative and push it to different places and get away from straightforward stories, to have different points of view, to learn about reliable and unreliable narrators. We wanted to connect to the audience, to have them gasp with horror and to cry and to laugh and to feel relief, to have sadness, and also to have that visceral gut feeling of psychological horror, to really push the meaning into the audience's head of what does it feel like to be in this situation. And still, while there is a clear indication that the audience is very important to the author, the audience is not yet a participant in the story. in the way that you can with an immersive, interactive fiction like a game. Next slide, please. And with video games, what's changed is that there is now agency to the player. The player has the ability to explore these events from the past, these settings that may have been long destroyed, or even fantastical settings in the future. We can now have alternate history like no other time. What would you have done in that situation? This is a place to explore not only that we are hearing about a story, telling a story, reenacting a story, but becoming part of that story, becoming part of that alternate history at the same time. This is what has been referred to in game design or game writing circles as story versus story. What does it mean to have a player story and an author story? Do they compete? Do they jive? Are they the same thing? Does the author want what the player wants? So I think these are very, very interesting stories about, what is the relationship between the player, who is also the audience, but is also an author in a way, and the person who crafted the story for the player to go through. Next slide, please. Still, we are still trying to understand, and we're still experimenting. What are the ways to convey emotion in a game that is beyond ponage, beyond victory and defeat? What are these more complicated emotions about guilt and redemption and questions of morality, things that are deeply personal and internal journeys? What are these meaningful experiences on an emotional level? And how can we connect to players in that way? So I think that there is still a long way that we're going with how to understand how games and how the participation in the game can convey these emotions. Next slide, please. So beyond the single player games or maybe the limited multiplayer games, but going on to like massively multiplayer games and virtual worlds, can we have stories about a society? Can we have shared player-driven experiences? I think EVE Online has shown that we can do that. And therein shows that there is this uneasy tension between the author and the audience, and the author who has now become the story architect, who builds a world where stories can emerge for the player. And we need to be able to encompass all of these stories within the same world and to feel that they are all connected, even if they are from multiple authors, that this is still all part of the same story. Next slide, please. So as we go forth into the future and we look at virtual reality, which is definitely the next thing on the scene, we have a perception of what is real and what is not real. We're going to trick our brains into thinking we are someplace that we are not, and that our hands are feeling something that we are not. This is a level of immersiveness that we haven't had before, because even though that we may be really, really immersed into our video game, we can still feel that, I am here in this world and I'm looking at a screen, and that screen has been a bit of a barrier. So this is sort of the next frontier of what is it going to be like to experience a video game, or to experience any kind of story inside a world that is really built up between our mind and the author that is out there. Next slide, please. So I really want to end this with the same thought, is that throughout history that we're still trying to seek this connection. We are still trying to find the deeper meaning and have those powerful, meaningful experiences that originated from this tribal fireplace, and to have those gatherings and to have those social experiences in which that we can have this role play, we can have those extra feelings of connection between society and between the world and between our players. And furthermore, I think that it really cements this relationship between author and audience. So thank you very much for listening to my thoughts.
Thank you, Sandy. And if anyone has questions from the audience, we'd be happy to hear them now. And while the audience is thinking, Sandy, I'm just going to move my presentation up into place. I just have a couple things to go over. It was a wonderful presentation, and I think I learned so much listening. Okay, Bryn O is asking, how important do you feel an open-ended interactive narrative is to VR experiences?
I think that we are open to both kinds of experiences. Just like in video games, there are open-ended video games, but there are also some very linear experiences that are maybe more akin to being in the middle of an action movie, and yet they appeal to certain consumers. So while I think that it probably is more interesting to have that open-endedness in a VR experience and in a video game, to be able to give the player choices in what they're doing, I think that people look to these experiences for different reasons, and it may be that they prefer a more guided experience, and certainly we see that with young children. Definitely we need more of a guided experience than with adults, for instance, and so there are different audiences that prefer to have different experiences, and we've seen that even with the very small casual games versus the hard 60-hour long games, right? So I think there's room in the market for a lot of different experiences, and that it may also run into a limitation of how big can that open-ended experience be in terms of how long can somebody be strapped into a VR set, right? So in the past, when they had VR, the images that you showed were not lifelike, so it did not do as well, but it still had like a really clunky interface to go into there, and so it remains to be seen as to what the audience will do. Right now, I've just finished a really long research project. I had a fellowship on education and games. So I've learned a lot about edu-LARPing, which is educational live-action role-playing games. I have learned a lot about the business of selling to schools, and I'm hoping to see that published in the near future. It is 10 years from the publication of Serious Games, so I'm revisiting that topic to see what has happened to educational game developers during this decade.
Truly Telling's asking, do you consider what we are doing here OSSL a game? She means OpenSim or Second Life as a game.
It could be. There certainly are games in Second Life. At the same time, you could also consider it an art form. You could consider it interactive fiction. And I think it's so many people have, you can have this wide debate on what is a game, which is really what throws down most of the game design SIG meetings is someone, starts having an argument about what exactly is a game. So I think like there are game-like experiences. There are games in terms of do they have win solutions and do they have solvable puzzles and so forth. So it really comes down to what is your definition of a game, and does it really need that victory condition in order for it to be a game, and does it need the rules? Does it need the structure? For me, I tend to think that it does. So I do describe certain experiences as interactive fiction or maybe as art games. I still think that they're very valuable to go through, and I think they're very interesting. But for me, I do think that the victory or fail conditions are important in terms of what is the definition of a game.
Okay, any more questions? Okay then, folks, I'm going to give you just a quick rundown about Immersive Edge. And then I will tell you what you need to know to view our story game in the most pleasurable way possible. A lot of people don't realize that Immersive Edge, the story started with avatars created by Fuchsia Nightfire. And those avatars were actually created from a poem I wrote, I think it was in 2005. And Fuchsia was this spring looking for a poem that she could turn into some avatars to donate to the Festa-V show. And these are the two that she made. They contain the full text of the poetry that I wrote in their bodies. And then Cherry Manga and Praline B put on a show in Festa-V with a multitude of avatars that they donated to the OpenSim community. And this is the environment that they displayed these two avatars in first, which got me thinking about who we are as avatars, how the avatars that we wear change us, how we present ourselves to someone that we love, and how even non-human avatars change our perceptions of ourselves. This is a list of the people participating in the project. This displays the creators for the first 6 scenes. And I think you'll recognize a lot of the names there. There are actually some 25 people who have contributed in various ways, scripting, hosting, solving problems. But these are the main designers of each region. And let me show you the list for the second group. There they are. Note here that we have 3 versions of Tin. And that is because when you reach the very end of scene 9, you'll be able to choose the ending that you want for this couple. So choose wisely. And real quick, let's go down the list of things you want to do. It says chat in IM or group. The group is not working, so I'm going to say chat in IM or voice. And the reason for this is that the story is revealed by the characters and by text narrative that's delivered through local chat. And if you're talking in the local chat, the story will get lost in that. So voice will be on in the regions, and you will have the various creators there to guide you through their region if you get stuck. So you can IM them or talk in voice, and everything will be fine there. You want to use the region win light settings to get the full effect of what the creators intended. Also turn on your audio and video streams because some of the information will be delivered automatically through those, so you'll want to have those set on before you go into the regions. And one last thing, we trigger these stories by you walking forward after you land. So be sure and hold still until the world reses around you, or it'll trigger and you won't see what's happening. You also want to wait for the companions. So like now we'll be sending through groups of 10. So you want to wait for everybody to land and give them a chance for the world to res around them, and then move forward and the story will start. And that is all I have for you. If you come back later on, if you look behind this, let me pick up Sandy's screen here. We have a bunch of freebies back here. Some are copies of the presentations. We'll add the ones that we're doing today back there. You can pick up the buttons and the screen there for the presentations. There's also a full copy of the machinima for the entire Immersive Edge. And there are the poetry avatars. And that purple box down there is the story sequencer that we use to drive the NPCs in these scenes. So you can get a copy of that and take it back and learn how to use it. Okay, that's all I have. Thank you all for coming.